This video is brought to you by Nebula. Yesterday evening, the leader of the Israeli opposition, Benny Gantz, announced that he would be leaving the three-man war cabinet composed of Gantz, Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. This wasn't a total surprise. Only a couple of weeks ago, both Gantz and Gallant threatened to quit unless Netanyahu came up with a plan for Gaza after the war. But it's nonetheless pretty massive news for Israel, and risks massively destabilising Israel's already fraught domestic politics. So in this video, we're going to have a look at why Gantz pulled out, what might happen next, and why this might not actually be as bad news for Netanyahu as it first appears. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand this story, we need to start with a bit of context. Before October the 7th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu led a coalition government that relied on a couple of far-right Israeli nationalist parties, led by National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, for its narrow majority in Israel's parliament, the Knesset. Netanyahu had in the past refused to form coalitions with these parties on the grounds that they were apparently too extremist, but he was forced into it after his usual coalition partners refused to govern with him after the November 2022 election, largely because Netanyahu was, and still is, facing a litany of plausible corruption allegations from his previous stints in office. This government was immediately unpopular, but it only became more so throughout 2023, when it tried to force through a series of controversial reforms to Israel's judicial system. Netanyahu's unpopularity and controversial politics meant that, after the Hamas attacks, it wasn't clear that his government had the political legitimacy to lead Israel during its time of crisis. To steady the ship and limit the influence of the far right, opposition politicians offered to form a national unity government. Netanyahu couldn't really refuse, and October the 11th, a three-man war cabinet was formed, including Netanyahu, Defence Minister and Likud MP Yoav Gallant, and Benny Gantz, a former IDF chief and the leader of the National Unity Party, who's basically the main opposition politician in Israel. However, over the past few months, the war cabinet has slowly fallen apart, largely because Netanyahu has refused to explain what his plan is for Gaza after the war. Things finally came to a head last month, when Gallant and Gantz publicly demanded that Netanyahu describe a day-after plan for Gaza. Then, on May the 19th, Gantz delivered an ultimatum, saying that he would withdraw from the cabinet unless Netanyahu agreed to his six-point post-war plan by June the 8th.
אם תעדיף את הלאומי על האישי ותבחר ללכת בדרכם של הרצל, בן גוריון, בגין ורבין, תמצא בנו שותפים למאבק. אבל אם תבחר ללכת בדרכם של קנאים ותוביל את האומה כולה אל תהום, נאלץ לפרוש מהממשלה.
This sparked a furious public spat between Gantz and Netanyahu, but it didn't really have time to escalate, because only a few days later the ICC issued its arrest warrant for Netanyahu. The ICC had a sort of unifying effect on Israeli politics, at least temporarily, because both Netanyahu and Gantz, as well as their supporters, thought the ruling was outrageous. There were then reports that Gantz was reconsidering his ultimatum in light of the prospective peace deal, which was proposed by US President Joe Biden on June the 4th. Biden's deal basically involved three phases. The first would involve a, quote, full and complete ceasefire, the exchange of some hostages for Palestinian prisoners, and an increase in humanitarian aid. The second phase would involve the release of all remaining hostages, and the third would involve, quote, a permanent cessation of hostilities. The Times of Israel reported that Gantz was prepared to drop his ultimatum if the peace deal went through, but this was always unlikely. For starters, even though Biden claimed that Israel had agreed to the deal, Axios reported that Netanyahu had only done so reluctantly, and the deal basically collapsed a day or so later. The far-right ministers in Netanyahu's government said they'd withdraw their support if he went for it, and Netanyahu himself said he was still committed to, quote, destroying Hamas, which clearly isn't consistent with the ceasefire envisioned in the deal. Then, on Tuesday, Time published the transcript of an interview with Biden, where the president claimed that there was every reason to believe that Netanyahu was prolonging the war for his own personal gain, which definitely didn't help. And on Thursday, a Saudi news outlet reported that Hamas had officially rejected the deal, claiming that the actual deal offered was substantially different to the one described by Biden, with no guarantee of a permanent ceasefire. Once it became clear that the deal wasn't going anywhere and Netanyahu wasn't going to provide a new post-war plan for Gaza, Gantz reasserted his ultimatum and pulled out of the war cabinet. So what happens next? Well, this leaves Netanyahu entirely reliant on the far right to stay in power, who will probably push him to escalate further in Gaza, and have ultimately advocated for Gaza to be resettled, i.e. for the Palestinians to be replaced by Jewish immigrants. This will further strain Netanyahu's relations with both its international partners and the majority of the Israeli public, who don't like the far right. This is obviously a politically precarious position, and an election is now significantly more likely than it was a couple of days ago. However, it's worth saying that an election wouldn't necessarily be bad news for Netanyahu. While Gantz was originally significantly more popular than Netanyahu, Netanyahu has successfully capitalised on the paranoid mood inside Israel, implicitly painting Gantz as a duplicitous American shill, and the poll gap between them has narrowed significantly in the past few weeks. In fact, a Channel 12 poll from May the 30th suggests that Netanyahu has actually overtaken Gantz as voters' preferred PM. Even if most voters don't like Netanyahu, he's clearly outmanoeuvring Gantz, and even if he doesn't have a plan for after the war, his somewhat primitive destroy Hamas mantra might still play well with an electorate that overwhelmingly supports continued escalation against not just Hamas, but also Hezbollah. For context, polling from April found that only 4% of Israeli Jews think that the IDF's assault on Gaza has gone too far, and polling from a few days ago found that 62% of Israelis, including a majority of centre-left voters, now want a full-scale war with Hezbollah. All in all, Israeli politics really does now feel more precarious than ever, and it looks like anything could happen. That's not the end of the story though, and if you want to continue learning more, then check out Nebula News. Nebula News is our joint venture with Nebula, where the TLDR team curates a selection of videos that matter most in the world right now. No more feeling out of touch or not knowing what to say at events. On Nebula News, we help guide you through the news that matters most, using videos from a huge variety of creators, helping you find stories that matter and avoiding burnout. It's not just curated news content brought to you directly by us. Nebula also features loads of exclusive original content. That's things like Real Life Law's brand new series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances before they land on YouTube. Now, if you're already subscribed to Nebula, you can find the brand new Nebula News section at nebula.tv/news. And be sure to bookmark or save that link so you can use it as your TLDR-ified news homepage. If you're not a member already, then click the link in the description to sign up now. If you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. That's less than £2 a month. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out.